Fresh Economic Thinking podcast, new ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir.
Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. You're with Cameron Murray, and here today I have a special guest, Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at Macro Business. I wanted to bring Leith here today to talk about immigration. Since COVID, Australia, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and many places have seen record high immigration after a very quiet 2 years during COVID lockdowns. Canada is looking at capping international student numbers, and a recent Australian Universities Accord interim report flagged the idea to tax international student fees in Australia. Leith has been following this topic for many years. Leith, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, cheers, Cameron. Anytime, mate.
Leith and I have written together about this topic in the past, and we've written at Macro Business, where Leith is now the chief economist. So there's a long history here. Perhaps, Leith, you could start by telling us, how did you start participating in immigration debates? Because although this current spike in the rate of immigration in many countries seems new, and in the news we always focus on what's happening now, it's not new for you. Where did you start, and how did we get from there to here?
Yeah, well, actually, it goes back almost 20 years, would you believe? So about literally 20 years ago this year, I started at the Australian Treasury, and I was basically indoctrinated into their 3Ps program. So I remember when you start there, you have an orientation sort of thing, and there was me and a whole bunch of other new recruits, and Ken Henry at the time, he was the secretary, got up there and basically espoused Treasury's 3Ps framework. So basically, the whole framework is, if you want to improve Australia's welfare, you need to follow the 3Ps, which is productivity, participation, and population. And at the time, it seemed to make sense. At the time, Australia's net overseas migration was about 120,000 thereabouts in the early 2000s or 2003, before it ramped up. And we didn't have all the population problems we've got now, etc. And there was it was sort of sold to us at the time that we need highly skilled migration. And that sort of kicked the ball, got the ball rolling. And then obviously worked at Treasury for about 3 years, came back to Melbourne in 2006, and then experienced obviously the biggest population boom I'd ever seen. Like, Melbourne just went nuts. We basically grew the fastest out of all the states. And it was only really at Macro Business. So I started Macro Business with a couple other guys in 2010. And went full time in 2011. It was about 2013 when I started writing about the population issue, and it was really in response. I remember the exact article. It was basically a guy called Rob Burgess, who used to write for Business Spectator and then also New Daily, wrote this long-winded article on how Australia's this miracle economy, and basically how we just we're recession-proof, and we're just this fantastic, amazing economy, blah blah blah. And I remember looking at the data, and I was just like, hang on. Per capita GDP is not that great. We've had multiple, GDP recessions, and I think at the time in 2000, I think we were right in the middle of a per capita recession, or very close. So I wrote a response to it, and then he wrote one back, and then I wrote one back, and then it became I just started looking more and more into it, and basically I've spent 10 years crusading against this really high immigration program that we've run pretty much since 2005, which is when it really started to take off, and then obviously. The last year has just been off the charts. Australia averaged about 85 to 90,000 net overseas migration in 60 years post World War II, and then from mid 2000s it basically went up by about 130% or something, and it went to really high levels.
When you say 130%, you're saying double plus 0.3.
Yes, basically, yeah. So basically the 15 years leading up to. I think it was 2005. We averaged. I'm going off memory here.
Yep.
About it was about 100,000 or 90 something thousand, 95,000 I think by memory. And then the 15 years before the pandemic, we averaged 220. And then obviously we had the dip during the pandemic, and then now we've got net overseas migration running about 500,000, and we're obviously seeing the problems manifest most visibly in the rental market. where rental vacancy rates are down at 0.9% across the capital cities. It's never before seen. Well, maybe it was seen post World War II sort of thing, but in anyone's living lifetime now, it's unseen. And obviously we've got all the problems, people living in cars and increase in homelessness, more people being forced to live in group housing, financial stress, blah, blah, blah. And I actually see it. So I live in a pretty wealthy, nice area in Melbourne called Ashburton, which is basically it's basically the worst suburb, but in the best, the most expensive local government area. So I'm surrounded by, rich suburbs, but I'm the worst suburb of that rich area. And it's really, heaps of parklands, and it's really nice.
Yep.
And I notice when I go for runs and stuff now, there's now people living in their cars we've got this massive series of parks, and you see it now, and it's just like, bloody hell, I've never seen this before in Melbourne. Oh, sorry, not in my patch of Melbourne.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to people. There was a family at my daughter's primary school, which she left last year. She went to high school, but there's a family I heard about, which was just a typical middle class family, whatever. They suddenly got booted out of their rental accommodation, and they were absolutely panicking. Couldn't get a house, had to move in with their parents, and all this sort of stuff. And this is in a sort of nice upper middle class area. And and you hear it all the time now, that there's just this gaping rental crisis developing with not enough housing and just growing the population like an absolute science experiment. And the scary thing is, I just don't know if it's going to stop, to be honest with you, Cam, because the stuff the federal government's done, it signed these 2 migration pacts with India, which we don't really know what it's about. But basically, you've got a country of 1.4 billion people with unemployment rate that's at 10%, like way worse than us. Basically, massive population of people are aged under 30. So about 2/3 of 1.4 billion people are aged under 30. And youth unemployment there's about 20%. It's like, well, of course they're going to want to get out of that situation. And they're going to want to come to places like Australia. And Albo signed these 2 migration pacts earlier this year, which basically says that we will recognise any qualification for work or migration purposes that are gained in India to be equivalent to Australia. There's also handing out 8-year post-study work visas to Indians, as well as 5-year study visas. So, you just wonder, well, you got this ginormous country which is quite impoverished and obviously have very high unemployment. Of course, they're going to want to come to Australia. And, you've got a country of 26 million, 1.4 million. You can see what could potentially happen.
1.4 billion, actually.
1.4 billion, sorry. Did I say million? Yeah, I meant billion.
500 times larger, not.
Yes. So, I mean, look, so
yeah.
is this level of immigration, is this going to become permanent? That's the question. Like, it's a real worry.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just put some numbers to it. So you said in the 90s, 15 years up to 2005, the ballpark was about 90,000 per year. So the population in Australia, population in Australia in 1996 was 18 million. So we're talking about half of 1% net migration a year in that period. And what we're looking at today, since 2006, was it? We've been at 200 and something. So
220
and
in the 15
220.
years.
Okay, so the population in 2014 was 23 million. So we're looking at 1%. So a doubling of the immigration rate in that 15-year pre-COVID period. And then in the last 12 months, it's been what, 500,000. So that's another doubling again. So we've gone from 0.5% in the 90s up to 2005. Then we've had 1% sort of the 15 years prior to COVID, 2005 to 2020. And now we're at 2%. And so that's quite a jump. Do you really think the 2% will be sustained, or do you think that's
but I mean,
a combination of but do you think it'll be sustained above that 1% of the previous 15 years, which is also quite high internationally and historically?
Well, see, I don't look at it in percentage terms. I don't think percentage is a great way to look at it, because if you held it, so if you ran a 1% immigration program forever, right? Obviously, as the population grows, that size just continually grows exponentially. So, for example, if Australia hits the Intergenerational Report's population forecast, which is basically in 40 years by 2063, we're supposed to be about 40.5 million. So 1% of that means we'll be doing 400,000 migrants permanently a year. Now, right now, we're doing more than that, obviously, but that would be 1%. And so it just means, and then once we get to 60 million, we'll be doing 600,000 migrants a year, net migrants. And it's just, so what that assumes is exponential growth. And obviously, in a nation like ours, which has got water supply problems and, pretty fragile environment, I prefer to look at the number rather than the percentage, because a fixed percent means exponential growth. That's just by definition, because as it grows, it keeps going up. So every year the level gets higher and higher, but it's still only 1%.
Even in percentage terms, though, it's off the charts. So in level terms, it's even more extreme. So you mentioned before about these new visas from India. That seems like there's a political desire to sustain these high levels. Can you maybe just paint us a picture of what proportion of immigration comes through what sort of visa streams? Like, how do people get here? There's obviously a bunch of regulations, and the real policy question is, how do we craft those regulations to allow certain people and not others? What's the picture? I mean, we have all these international students. Are they immigrants, or is it just the work visas? What's the sort of big picture take on the type of visas and how people end up here?
So Australia operates two separate systems, and one's capped and one's completely uncapped. So the capped one's obviously the permanent migration intake, and that's currently set at 190,000 a year for the non-humanitarian intake, and then the humanitarian intake's about to go up to 20,000. They've also juked the stats in that they're now including Pacific Island visa, but it's separate again, so that's another 3,000, but it's, so basically the permanent non-humanitarian is about 193,000 when you account for that. And then you got the humanitarian about 20, and that level's capped, and it's dominated by so-called skilled migrants, which I put quote marks because that's a bit spurious in itself, as you and I both know. But so about 2/3 of the permanent intake is skilled migration. One third is family reunions mostly. So that's if partners come across. Also, we give out about 8,000 elderly parent visas, which they should abolish, which effectively are to old people. So you can basically it's capped at 8,000. You can bring over 8,000 people who are elderly, retired, etc. So there's a lot of different categories, but at least that part of it's capped. The problem is that you've got this temporary migration system, which is completely uncapped. And as of September, according to the Department of Home Affairs, we had 2.3 million temporary migrants in the country. That's not including visitor visas. So if you take out the tourism part, we had 2.3 million, which have pretty much all got work rights.
So that's about 1 in 10 of the total population.
1 in 11, yeah, 1 in 11 to be exact. And effectively, that is dominated by the student visa route. So we had over 650,000 net student visas on issue in September. About another 200,000 graduate visas. So that's once they finish their studies, they can basically get on this graduate visa for several years and work in any job they want. So effectively, 1 in 30 Australians was on either a graduate visa or a student visa. And just to give you an idea about the levels of that, so I said 2.3 million as of September. That's actually 400,000 more than the 2019 peak before COVID. So this whole notion that we've got this immigration catch-up going on is completely spurious. Like
so we caught up and added 400,000 in about 18 months.
400,000, that's it, and 600,000 in a year. And that's basically what's driven this net overseas migration. So the way it works is most people come over as temporaries first, and then they transition, and then you've got 190,000, 193,000 plus 20,000 humanitarians. So what's that, 213 or something thousand of those then get to become permanent residents. But the problem with it is we often don't, if you don't, succeed in those, we don't send them home. They just end up hanging around, switching visas, try and get a bridging visa, try and extend their stay. So we've got this stock of temporaries that just keeps growing, as well as this really high permanent visa thing. And obviously, the more permanents you hand out, that actually increases the stock of migration because they don't leave, right? So temporaries, in theory, should eventually
most
increase
temporary
stock, but they should leave.
Yeah, most of them leave, but the number here at any one time continues to grow.
It's swelling through the roof like we have not seen before. So, and the composition of our migration's also changed. I mentioned before that obviously we've got this Indian migration pact, and that hasn't really kicked in yet, but India is now our biggest source nation because through the student route. We're also getting a lot of from Nepal and these other sort of poor developing nations who are coming through the student visa route. And viewers have probably seen a lot of the reports about these ghost colleges that have opened up all around. You see them in Melbourne, around the city and stuff, selling these bogus degrees. And it's just basically a way to come in here on the cheap and then basically qualify for a student visa, and then you end up just working anyway. And then try and extend your stay, etc.
The universities are interesting in all this because they are essentially, through this visa system, they've almost been given a license to sell residency to Australia, haven't they? And so I find it interesting that now there's this tax on international student fees being considered. And I do wonder whether, why the government just doesn't sell citizenship, if it's such a good idea. Just sell it off. But it also seems to be a bit global. Like Canada's having the same discussions. The UK, do you think that is coincidental, or do you think the same political pressures are in each of those countries to try and maybe avoid a recession by pumping up the number of people and keeping spending up? How would you speculate on why this pattern seems common to this handful of countries?
It is weird, isn't it? So basically all the Anglo countries other than the US are effectively pursuing the same policy at the same time. So Canada's actually, if you think it's extreme here, Canada's even more extreme. So Canada's, in the year to March or June, the most recent data that came out, basically they had 1.2 million net overseas migration, and that's on a country that's 40 million. So it's a rate that's way higher than us, and obviously in absolute number terms it dwarfs what we've done. And basically, they've got all the same problems. They've got a massive rental crisis. They've got this, it's all being driven by the international students is the biggest driver. Lots of concern about sort of sham colleges and sort of sham visas and blah, blah, blah. It's all the same sort of stuff. New Zealand now is a little bit behind us, but they've now got record net overseas migration as well. And hilariously, there's now all this concern about a housing crisis in Auckland. Which is probably a discussion for another day, but you and I know about that pretty closely. And the UK is also, UK in terms of percentage terms is way below us because it's got a much bigger population, but they're also got in number terms record immigration. It does make you wonder what's driving this. And the hilarious thing is the Albanese government, one of the excuses they used during the Jobs and Skills Summit, etc., to basically ramp up this immigration is that we're competing for migrants against Canada.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like, well, why do we need to compete with them? And so they created this false narrative that we've got this immigration catch up to do, and B, that we've got this global race for talent, which is another term that Great Institute uses all the time, which is just bananas. Like it's just a stupid term, but it's made up to sort of fit this narrative. And then, no doubt Canada's using it against us as well.
That's right. It's a race to the bottom. It's it's an arms race. I guess on that, a lot of people would argue that, educated young people from other countries, the best and brightest, if they have an additional option to move to Australia and they think it's the best choice for them, isn't that welfare enhancing? Like, for them and us? Like, you're almost saying that trade is bad when it comes to people. How do you respond? Like, don't we want young and smart people here? Isn't that what the argument about competing for talent is about? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, the problem with it is, though, I'd be all for that if we actually were competing for talent. So, the actual outcomes from the graduates that we're getting from overseas are actually very poor in terms of, they're basically their labour force participation. So we've got, they work a lot less full time than what local graduates do. They're paid way less. Pretty much, across the board, the outcomes are very poor. I'd be all for going for quality. Like I personally think Australia's whole immigration system should be based around a much smaller number, but extremely high quality. But unfortunately, the permanent temporary so-called skilled migrants we get here get paid a fair bit less than the median full-time salary here. And the median full-time salary is dragged down by obviously unskilled people. So it's not really
Yeah.
even a skilled salary, yet our skilled migrants and our, student graduates and all these people are paid well under that level. So it sort of makes you think, well, are we really getting skilled people?
Yeah.
Are
So
we competing for talent?
it sounds like there's a trade-off there. It's a bit like universities, right? The more people you try and get through universities, the lower the standards have to be to get everyone through. And I think that seems like the same conundrum in this migration. If you want the best, but you're trying to maximize the quantity, you're going to have to just let some, not very skilled or qualified people in as well. I mean, it seems similar, right?
Can I just also add that the reason why Australia gets so many international students is because we offer the most generous work rights in the world. So our post-study work rights and also our ability to work while you're here, and also our English language requirements when you come here, etc. They're all incredibly generous, and that's effectively the reason why we're obviously a very high standard of living developed country, so that makes us very desirable. But then also, you can come here and work pretty much instead of studying, which is kind of unique. I mean, Canada does it as well, but ours are way more generous than anywhere else, our work rights. So effectively, we've kind of created this system where the international education industry is really a migration industry. They're not coming here. Well, some do. I mean, I'm generalizing here, obviously. But, by and large, the whole industry is centered around migration, not around studying to get a degree and then going home and using your skills, which is really, and the whole thing about welfare enhancing, you're also stripping young people from developing nations who probably need those young people. So there's also a bit of inequality aspect there as well. Like I don't think that's particularly, if you're basically pulling the young people there to basically work in lesser jobs here and not use the skills they've created, and then they've been underemployed here, is that better than them going home and enhancing their own economies, who actually need those skills? I think it's actually pretty, it could potentially be globally welfare destroying, I think, the system that we're running.
Anyway, I've had this discussion before, right? And I said, well, what location, if you trained up the next doctor for humanity, thinking of Earth as a whole, in what location would you put that doctor to maximize their benefit to others from having those skills? And arguably, it's not Sydney. And it's quite likely a country in Central Africa or in Asia that is a source country of many doctors in Australia. And so on the one hand, we're attracting these doctors trained abroad. And on the other hand, we have Doctors Without Borders going back to those countries because there's a shortage of doctors to volunteer and provide services. So I think that's a real issue, right? Imagine you're Thailand and you've been trying to develop, you're working real hard, you're training doctors and engineers like crazy, but Australia opens the door and says any doctor or engineer from Thailand can come here, right? As a development program in that country, you'd be like, hey, you're taking our best and brightest, you're undermining our progress here. But some people want to dismiss that, and I get it. People should, more choice is better for the individual than less. But I think as a policy matter, it's something that needs to be considered for sure. Can I just ask you, Leith, you've been talking about immigration for 10 years, as you say. How often do you get called racist?
Oh, all the time, mate. Yeah, look. Unfortunately, all the time. I'm not going to name the individual who does it the most, but he's a well-known person who's also attacked UCAN, as we both know. I won't name him, but look, it just, unfortunately,
so why isn't it racist to talk about immigration policy?
Because whenever I talk about it, typically it's about numbers, right? Because my whole issue is I'm not against immigration. I know you're not against immigration, and we wouldn't even be having this discussion if the federal government hadn't just decided on a whim to ramp it in the mid-2000s. Like I never thought it was a problem. Never even, it never even came to my thinking. I always thought it was a good thing until, several years into this immigration boom when they decided to more than double it in the mid-2000s. And because I live in Melbourne, I've seen the results, because suddenly the traffic congestion went through the roof. Obviously, the whole housing situation is a joke. It's even worse in Sydney. And it's not just in terms of prices and stuff. It's basically, when I grew up in Melbourne, I grew up I just went to a regular, state school, whatever, right? And primary school and all that sort of thing. And only one of my friends that I knew of, and he was he had a single mum, it was just him and his mum, lived in a flat. And another friend of mine with a single mum lived in a proper house and everything. And everyone else just lived in a house with a backyard. And that was just the normal thing. Now it's no longer the normal thing because Melbourne's grown from back then, 2.8 million would have been back then, to over 5 million. And we just don't have the space. And now it's like apartment living's become normal, renting's become more normal. And I've just seen the dilution in quality of life. And this has happened primarily because the population's grown so quickly. And it takes forever to drive anywhere. It's just general quality of life stuff. Your sardine packed onto a train if you want to take one. It's just general quality of life has been degraded. And I guarantee you, if the Melbourne 2005 when I was at 2006 when I was at the Victorian Treasury, it might have been 2007, around that time, they were working on the Melbourne 2030 policy framework. And they basically said that, by 2030, Melbourne's population was going to be less than what it ended up being like 2017.
Oh, wow.
Because the population, because back then we weren't expecting to go through this massive immigration boom. The penny hadn't dropped yet. And, if you look at the intergenerational report, the first one in 2001, Australia passed the 2050 projection, like in about 2020. So it's just we basically got there 40 years early or something, or whatever it is. Maybe it's 2060 projection, but it was just so many decades early because the government back then they modelled it on 90,000 a year net overseas migration, which had been the average, and then it obviously just got ramped up, and then we've seen it right across Sydney, Melbourne, probably Brisbane where you are. Just the infrastructure has not kept pace, and arguably the housing doesn't get pace. And then there's environmental issues. The State of the Environment report that gets released every 5 years, it's basically the intergenerational report of the environment, warns that the environment's getting wrecked. Every one of them says it's getting worse for the environment. And one of its biggest risks is population growth. And, it was only 3 or 4 years ago that Sydney almost ran out of water. It got down, the dams got down to 20%. And, what's going to happen next time we have a long drought and Sydney's got an extra 1 million people? We're going to have to build a battery of desal plants and somehow pump it 30 kilometres inland uphill to Western Sydney, which is where they're dumping most of the migrants. Like, it's just all these practical issues just do not compute. And it doesn't add up, this population growth we're running, because nothing can keep up with it. And then the result is obviously reduced living standards.
Yeah, so I guess cast your mind back to the late 50s. It's imagine you're living then, and resources are scarce because you're just adapting to coming out of the war that took a lot of resources. It seems also like the same arguments would have applied then, but you're also saying in the 90s things were good. Is there a sort of levels rate distinction here? Like, we had the baby boom, that was a lot of population growth and seemed okay in retrospect. I mean, I don't know what it was like. We've had periods of high growth in the 70s as well. Can't we just build enough to keep up? Isn't that what we've done historically? Or am I, playing devil's advocate? What am I missing, I guess?
Well, I mean, just look at the empirical evidence. That the fact of the matter is we were keeping up fine. So if you think back to Sydney, during the Sydney Olympics in 2000, I think that was almost peak Sydney back then. Maybe just because the Olympics was on, but also, livability and all that. And the population was growing at a sort of slow and steady rate. Everything was keeping up. I think the optimal rate is just basically the pre-2005 level of migration. It worked. It worked pretty well for 60 years. And that seems to be the natural rate that did work. It's just that when they ramped it up, it stopped working. And the whole thing about, in 1950, Australia was 8 million people, right? So we didn't need to populate. We weren't big enough. But I'd argue that Sydney and Melbourne now of over 5 million each. What's Brisbane? It's probably getting close to 3.
A couple of million, it depends.
Yeah, especially if you count the Gold Coast. It'd be over 3 million. So I just think both Sydney and Melbourne got above their optimal size. It's now we're getting diseconomies of scale down here, because if you need to build any new infrastructure now, you've got to basically do it underground.
Yeah.
So if you need to build a new road, you got to tunnel it, and that costs a hell of a lot of money. Whereas when back in the 50s, when Melbourne was probably $1.5 million, maybe, We had tons of space, easy to do greenfield development, etc. But it's got to the stage now where the sprawl's massive, everything's built out. If you want to just keep adding more and more people, it actually becomes harder. And then, of course, we've got the natural barrier of water supply, which Australia doesn't have enough water in the southeast to accommodate this level of population. If you average it out over, obviously we've had 3-year La Nina, which record rainfalls, that helps obviously. But if you do it over a 20-year period and you average it out, we don't have enough water to sustain the sorts of populations that are predicted, which is 40 million by 40.5 million by 2063 in 40 years. So we're supposed to add, just huge amounts of people in, 14 million people. That's a Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide in 40 years.
So I guess from what I'm hearing, it sounds like we should send everyone to Canberra who gets here, because that's where the gains. It's easier to accommodate more people quicker, because it's a somewhat underdeveloped city compared to.
I would love that, because I guarantee you the charlatans who push this policy would then be impacted directly. And I also think we should, if we want to keep doing this, let's build high rise in Woollahra, Mossman, all the rich Sydney eastern suburbs, because they're the elites who push this policy. The high rise Harry Triguboffs of the world, etc. Well, how about we just stuff them? We stuff all the people in those places. We build high rises right across the coast, on the beaches and that sort of stuff, and they can feel the pressure from it. And I guarantee if we said we're going to do that, and they couldn't object, which they can, and we won't do it because they're powerful. But they would suddenly go, hang on, I don't want this anymore. And the other thing is we need to do is another problem with this policy is Treasury's become almost like a big business lobby rent seeker on this, because the federal government collects 80% of the tax revenue, right? The states collect and local governments collect 20%. So we've got this, the incentives aren't aligned. So the federal government loves big Australia immigration because it boosts company taxes and also personal income taxes. Yeah. More people, so they get the gains, but the costs are pushed onto the state governments. Because
it's the schools, hospitals, roads, and all that.
They've got to do all the public services, infrastructure. And then the way they get around is they flog everything off. They privatise everything to try and get the money in quickly, and then you end up with Transurban taking over Sydney with 20 toll roads to build, because they have to build all the infrastructure. So 20 years ago, you could drive around Sydney and only pay tolls on 2 roads, and you could pretty much get around toll free if you wanted to. Now you've got Transurban pulling money out of your wallet wherever you drive. And that's actually a dilution of living standards. But the costs don't fall on the federal government. So the federal government keeps pushing this policy. And what we need is, I guarantee if there's some way we could say the Treasury's got to pay $100,000 to the states for every migrant that settles in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland to cover their lifetime infrastructure costs, I guarantee you, Treasury would not be as gung-ho about running this big Australia.
You think
they
the
wouldn't just get the
policy
gains, they'd have to pay the
things would change quickly. I guess also if they had to live in the neighbourhoods of all the elected politicians and radically densify those neighbourhoods. So here's a question then. Australia essentially has an open border with New Zealand in terms of work rights and migration. And of course, Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales have open borders, except for COVID lockdowns.
We're all coming up to you, mate, in Brisbane.
Why isn't this bad? I mean, I've got all these, I'm in Brisbane and all the Southerners are coming up here, bringing their incomes, bidding up prices, at least temporarily for housing and generally requiring, Queensland's having a massive build out of schools and hospitals at the moment. Why is that okay, but more of an open borders to the rest of the world not? How do you reconcile those differences?
Well, Australia's a nation state, right? So we're one country. so you can't restrict movement between different states. I mean, unless you want to go back to federation and make it state-based again.
Well, I'm guessing why wouldn't it be better if we did that, if we're also going to restrict the national border?
Okay, well, I mean, look. I'm a firm believer in nation states. I believe in nation states. Australia is Australia. This is our border, and I don't want to sound like John Howard here, but it's up to us to decide who comes in. All that sort of stuff. And the whole thing is, it's like the politicians are supposed to represent their constituents, which are the Australian people, and they're supposed to run policy for the benefit of the Australian people. Now, if the open borders people seem to think anyone should be able to live in Australia if you want, well, that's fine. If you want that, expect to have an Australia of 150 million very quickly, and they're basically living in favelas, because that's what will happen, and we're going to run out of water, and basically living standards are going to be destroyed. The natural environment in Australia is going to get destroyed. Australia's got a very delicate environment, and I think politicians need to safeguard that, be custodians of that. That's my view, and the whole notion of open, there's this view of some people go, we've got to take a global view of everything, right? So, someone in some country somewhere else's welfare is just as important as an Australian. To me, that I don't want to sound selfish, but I'm an Australian, so I care about Australians first, right? And if you want to take that thinking to the extreme, you would never build another school in Australia, you'd never build another hospital, because you get far more global benefit from building in Bangladesh or some other place that's a lot poorer and needs it more than we do.
Yeah, exactly.
So how far do you want to take this logic?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for me, the difference is this, right? If you're within a polity, like within a country that is a sort of unit of welfare enhancement, like we all sort of do things for the collective good at this level, then the internal migration is not such a big deal, because if someone leaves Sydney and comes to Brisbane, they're still paying into the pot that can be shared with the states at their new location. So it might be the fact they need a new school here, but that means the expansion of the school in Sydney can be delayed. And through all these funding mechanisms, their share sort of gets relocated geographically. So, it's a bit like moving from one council to another in Sydney. You sort of take your income and impose costs elsewhere, but someone else will switch back to the other spot. So it's a sort of,
and also
there's a sort of
distributed, all that sort of stuff.
So the costs are not like additional, they are just relocated, just like the person. Whereas the population growth as a whole is an additional cost to the polity in aggregate. And I think the sort of the open borders people, I get their welfare argument. We're all humans, and it's at some point we have to acknowledge that we can't just do what's good for Australians and sacrifice lives in other countries for it. But I think the political reality of how we're organised into states means that the free movement within states sort of insulates Australians from it's a topic I spoke to Tim Helm about in a previous podcast, from this spatial equilibrium of equalising quality of life between places. If we have a border, it can allow us to have a higher quality of life than other places in the world. So I think that makes total sense. Leith, I want to wrap it up now. Is there anything you'd like to add that we've missed, or where can our listeners find your writing or hear more of your views on this topic and any other economic topics?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Cam. First of all, if you want to read my views on this topic and others, go to macrobusiness.com.au. I pretty much write about the immigration, debate almost daily, and I have for several years, to be quite honest. And whether that's in relation to the rental crisis or just policy more generally, that's probably the best place to go.
Perfect.
So just macrobusiness.com.au. I'm often I've got to warn you, some of my topics and articles are a bit spicy. So often I'll take down a spruiker.
Right. I think that's perfect for the listeners of Fresh Economic Thinking. Thanks again for your time, Leith. Let's wrap it up.
Cheers. Thanks, Ken.